So we all know Normandy. We've seen the beaches, we've heard the speeches. D-Day is taught in classrooms, shown in movies, and drilled into memory. Somehow, we all grew up with it. But what if I told you there was a battle in Normandy that almost no one talks about? A battle not on a beach, but on a hill. And it wasn't just bloody, it was vicious, close, personal. Picture this: Waffen-SS grenadiers and Wehrmacht veterans storming up a hillside through fog and shrapnel, charging toward a handful of American GIs who had nothing left but artillery and guts. It's like that hill in Afghanistan, Battle of Kamdesh, where US soldiers held out, except this was 1944, and it wasn't the Taliban climbing that slope, it was German Panzer Grenadiers with orders from Berlin itself. This is the story of Hill 314, a hill soaked in fire and blood. You've heard of Normandy, but you haven't heard this. On the morning of August 7th, 1944, the high ground east of Mortain became the centre of a brutal and largely forgotten 5-day siege. German Panzer Grenadiers encircled Hill 314, where elements of the US 120th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion had dug in. Nearly 700 American soldiers, cut off, surrounded and exposed. What followed was one of the most intense small unit actions of the Normandy campaign. The attack came not from regular Wehrmacht troops, but from the Waffen-SS. Specifically, the 17th SS Panzer Division Götz von Berlichingen, a seasoned but depleted formation thrown into battle with a near-impossible task, dislodged the entrenched Americans from the hill at all costs. Though often outnumbered and lacking the tank support and coordination that had once made the German advance so effective, the SS soldiers launched repeated uphill assaults into concentrated artillery and machine gun fire. The Americans held the heights, but paid for every hour in blood. The Germans pounded the hill with mortars and the terrifying 88mm guns, scything through rock, timber and flesh. At close range, Panzer Grenadiers tried to storm the ridgeline again and again, only to be repulsed by determined infantry and pre-planned American artillery strikes. On one occasion, the two sides were so close that an American officer called down artillery on his own position to avoid being overrun. Conditions on the hill rapidly deteriorated. The American defenders, without food or medical aid, searched the bodies of their fallen comrades for spare ammunition and rations. Makeshift morgues were dug among the rocks, and blood seeped into the soil with every new attack. Attempts to resupply the hill failed almost entirely. Artillery units fired shells filled with food and bandages, but most burst on impact, scattering their contents into the mud. C-47 aircraft dropped crates from the air, but high winds carried many parachutes into German-controlled territory. The men on Hill 314 were, for all practical purposes, left to die. Still, they held. As the Waffen-SS regrouped and launched further attacks, losses mounted on both sides. The Americans had the high ground and the artillery advantage, but the Germans fought with a relentless fury, driven by orders from Berlin and the personal reputations of SS officers who could not afford to fail. For 5 straight days the fighting continued. It was no longer about ground or victory, it was survival. Finally, on August 12th, the Germans withdrew. They had failed to take the hill, but they had inflicted severe losses. Of the 670 American defenders, more than 300 were killed or wounded. Some elements of the American 7th Corps had stormed ashore during the D-Day landings. Others followed in the days after, reinforcing the US positions in Normandy's bocage country. Though the Corps technically belonged to Lieutenant General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, still awaiting activation, General Omar Bradley temporarily attached them to his 1st Army, assigning them to fight through the hedgerows west of St. Lo. Supporting the operation from the west was Troy Middleton's 8th Corps, positioned to move in behind the German lines once the front broke open. But as Operation Cobra prepared to launch, disaster struck before the attack even began. On July 24, 1944, coordination between air and ground forces faltered during the first saturation bombing run. Heavy cloud cover obscured the drop zones, and miscommunication over the bomb line distances led to catastrophe. Bradley had ordered his assault troops to pull back just 1,200 yards from the line of fire, far less than the standard 3,000-yard safety margin. As a result, several waves of American bombers dropped short. 25 US soldiers were killed, and over 130 were wounded by their own bombs before they even met the enemy. Ironically, the Germans suffered relatively light losses that day, around 350 casualties and 10 destroyed vehicles. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Division, even believed the American bombardment had ended and moved some of his forward outposts back into position. Dissatisfied with the results, General Bradley approved a second, much larger bombardment for the following day, this time involving both tactical and strategic bombers under British Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. On July 25th, the sky over St. Lo turned to fire. The effect was devastating. Bayerlein's division, considered one of the most elite armoured formations in the entire Wehrmacht, was virtually annihilated. Over 2,000 men were lost, more than half of the division's combat strength. Its radio network was obliterated. Its tanks were scattered. Only Kampfgruppe Heinz, positioned beyond the blast zone, remained operational. The Panzer Division, once the pride of German armoured warfare, had been reduced to wreckage in a single morning. But again, the price was not paid by the enemy alone. Several waves of American bombs once again fell short. This time, the toll was even higher. Over 100 US soldiers were killed and nearly 500 wounded by friendly fire. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the commander of Army Ground Forces, an officer whose place was usually behind a desk in Washington, but who had insisted on visiting the front. His death sent shockwaves through the American High Command. Despite the chaos, the assault began as planned. Just before noon on July 25th, the US 7th Corps surged forward along a 5-mile front on the Saint-Lô to Perrier's Road. Major General Joseph Lawton Collins had assembled a force of 120,000 men, backed by 600 artillery pieces. The objective was clear: crack the German line and open the road to Avranches. On the Corps' right flank, the US 9th Infantry Division ran headlong into stiff resistance. German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers of the 13th Regiment, part of the 5th Parachute Division, held firm. Trained, experienced, and dug in, the German airborne units resisted every inch of ground. The Americans broke through the first line, but could push no further. On the left, Major General Leland Hobbs's 30th Infantry Division advanced more successfully, capturing the ruined village of Ebercrevon amid clouds of smoke and shellfire. It was a brutal start, but Operation Cobra had begun, and the first cracks in the German line were starting to appear. As the center of the American line advanced, a regiment of the US 4th Infantry Division ran headlong into one of the few remaining armored strongpoints of the Panzer Division. Despite suffering heavy losses in the previous day's bombardment, elements of the division had regrouped and dug in, positioning their last surviving tanks to blunt the advance. The Americans fought through them with a combination of close-range bazooka fire and M4 Sherman tanks, but even after the clash, the day's objectives had not been met. The plan had called for a 3-mile breakthrough. By nightfall, the Americans had managed to advance only 1 mile beyond the Saint-Lô to Perrier Road. Momentum improved the following day. US infantry began riding into battle on the backs of tanks, leaping off to clear every hedgerow, ditch, and tree line with ruthless precision. The battle-hardened 1st Infantry Division was now clearing hedgerows in under 3 minutes, where just weeks before it had taken hours to advance a few hundred yards. The learning curve had been paid in blood, but it was beginning to bear fruit. On July 26th, American forces turned their attention toward Marigny. Leading the push was Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division, but the advance quickly slowed. Congestion, craters, and destroyed infrastructure turned every road into a bottleneck. Yet even here, the Americans had adapted. Their Sherman tanks had been modified into so-called rhinos, welded with iron tusks made from captured German beach obstacles. These plows allowed them to punch directly through the bocage hedgerows, bypassing ambush zones and avoiding predictable roadways. The German panzers, lacking similar adaptations, were forced to stay on the roads, where they were increasingly vulnerable to artillery and air attack. As combat command stalled, reserves from the 2nd Armored Division were brought forward. A German Kampfgruppe, comprised of around 30 armored vehicles, including a heavy Hummel self-propelled gun armed with a 150mm cannon, attempted to seize a key crossroads near the village of Notre-Dame-de-Senilly. A single company of American armored infantry, backed by Shermans, held the position throughout the night. The German counterattack was fierce and determined, but the crossroads held. Elsewhere, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich entered the fight. A column of 15 Panzer IV tanks, accompanied by 200 elite paratroopers from the German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, attempted to overrun an American outpost defended by a lone company from the US 4th Infantry Division. The initial assault was blunted by 2 batteries of M7 Priest self-propelled guns and a handful of M10 tank destroyers. Holding the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive, the Americans launched a counterattack and ultimately forced the Germans to withdraw. But it had been a close-run engagement. Both sides had committed some of their best troops, and both had fought with relentless intensity. On the afternoon of July 27th, the skies opened once again. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers swept in over the battlefield, targeting a German column attempting to escape south through the Ronsi pocket. Nearly 500 German vehicles were packed into the narrow lanes, trucks, tanks, supply carriers, desperate to escape encirclement. By nightfall, the Thunderbolts had destroyed 122 tanks, 259 vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces. British Typhoons joined the onslaught, strafing roads with 20mm cannon fire and rocket strikes. 9 tanks and 28 more vehicles were destroyed in the coordinated attack. The night was no quieter. German troops, trapped out of position and aware of the noose closing around them, launched a series of desperate breakouts. One such force, nearly 1,000 strong and supported by armored vehicles, attempted to smash through American lines near Saint-Denis-le-Gast. But the breakout failed. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson Coleman, commander of the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment of the 2nd Armored Division, led the American response. The German column was shattered, its survivors scattered across the hedgerows. It was now clear the German front in Normandy was collapsing. But for the men still fighting on Hill 314, both American and German, the worst was yet to come. Friday, July 28th, Major General Robert Grove's 6th Armored Division, part of Troy Middleton's 8th Corps, began advancing down the main highway to Coutances. 3 miles east, Major General John Wood's 4th Armored Division pushed forward along a parallel route, also toward Coutances. Both columns encountered the same scene. Miles of wreckage, the burned-out remains of shattered German convoys, still smouldering from Allied airstrikes the day before. Tanks, trucks, horse-drawn carts, and bodies blocked the roads. So far in Operation Cobra, organized German resistance had been minimal. The front lines had simply disintegrated. By nightfall, American spearheads had already passed through Coutances and were racing south toward the next major objective, Avranches, the gateway to Brittany. German units, many of them shattered remnants moving on foot or by wagon, retreated in chaos through the lower Cotentin Peninsula. The relentless pressure from American ground forces was made worse by constant P-47 Thunderbolt air attacks. Every road became a killing field. The next day, July 29th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division rolled into Avranches. There was no battle. The Germans had already pulled out. For the first time in weeks, there was no gunfire, just relief, tears, and celebration. 2 days later, the scope of the collapse became clear. Middleton's 8th Corps took 7,000 German prisoners in a single sweep. Most were so demoralized they didn't resist or even require escort. US soldiers simply disarmed them and pointed them toward the rear. "We face a defeated enemy," General Patton told officers of the 4th Infantry Division. An enemy terribly low in morale, terribly confused. With the breakthrough complete, General Bradley made his move. he turned operational control of the 8th Corps over to General Patton, summoned him to headquarters, and gave him the order he had waited months to hear. The Third Army would be officially activated on August 1st. Patton was now responsible for the liberation of Brittany. At the same time, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was promoted to command the First Army. Bradley retained overall control of both under the newly formed 12th U.S. Army Group. Patton wasted no time. He personally travelled to Coutances to take charge of the 8th Corps and wasted no opportunity to make his presence known. When he encountered soldiers digging defensive positions, he erupted. "It is stupid to be afraid of a beaten enemy," he barked. On July 29th, the spearhead of the 6th Armoured Division forced a crossing of the Saule River just west of Coutances. The Germans offered only sporadic resistance. While some German pockets continued to fight hard, the front as a whole had collapsed. There was no coordination, no second line, just retreat. Realizing that Brittany was about to fall, German forces made a final attempt to block the advance. They raced toward the vital Saloon River Bridge south of Avranches, hoping to secure it before the Americans. But they were too late. Sherman tanks of the 4th Armoured Division reached the crossing first, and after a brief firefight, pushed the Germans back. The enemy withdrew towards Saint-Malo. By the end of the push, the combined efforts of the 4th and 6th Armoured Divisions had captured over 4,000 prisoners. The infantry that followed took 3,000 more. Operation Cobra had not only shattered the German line, it had opened the door to a new phase of the war in Western Europe. On July 31st, 1944, General George S. Patton met with the staff officers of his newly activated Third Army. The message was clear. The advance into Brittany would begin the following morning. Patton, animated and fiery as ever, gave two simple instructions. First, move fast. Second, don't worry about your flanks. Flanks are something for the enemy to worry about, he told them. Then, in classic Patton style, he added, "We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time, and we're going to go through him like crap through a goose." The next day, August 1st, Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps surged into Brittany. To the east, Major General Wade Heislip's 15th Corps swung south toward Le Mans, the command centre of the German 7th Army. Patton's plan was bold. Seize Brest, Lorient, Saint-Malo and the Quiberon Peninsula, then pivot east to encircle the German forces still locked in combat with the British and Canadians around Caen. It was an audacious vision, but for now it remained unofficial. Eisenhower had not yet signed off on the plan, and Patton, still under scrutiny for his earlier conduct in Sicily, had to be cautious about pushing beyond his authority. That same day, Patton arrived in Avranches. It was a vital crossroads and a logistical nightmare. 2 armoured divisions and 2 infantry divisions, over 100,000 men and nearly 20,000 vehicles had to cross a single bridge. The entire advance could have been paralysed by traffic, but when Patton reached the city, he stepped into the chaos himself. For hours, the general personally directed traffic at the head of the bridge, waving tanks and trucks through the bottleneck to the cheers of passing soldiers. It was a scene few forgot. The commander of an entire army, standing in the dust and diesel smoke, clearing the way with his own hands. In those first hours, Patton had a habit of bypassing his staff, issuing direct orders to his division commanders without warning. But that quickly changed. The sheer scale of the operation made staff coordination essential. That night, elements of his lead armoured columns became lost in the dark countryside, struggling to follow orders or even identify the correct roads. German artillery harassed the flanks and Luftwaffe bombers struck at road junctions, but despite the confusion, Combat Command A and Combat Command B reached their objectives by dawn, Saint-Georges and Saint-Hilaire de Harcourt, south of the Saloon River. For Middleton, now serving under Patton rather than Bradley, the shift was immediate and dramatic. Bradley had moved methodically, favouring cautious and well-coordinated advances. Patton pushed forward aggressively, favouring momentum over precision. When Middleton submitted a detailed operational plan for approval, Patton dismissed it outright. Time, not terrain, was the enemy now. From aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports, Patton knew the German forces in Brittany had little to offer in the way of armour or artillery. His men weren't to fear counterattacks. If they encountered resistance, they were to bypass it. Infantry and support units would mop up what remained. Patton's only concern was that German engineers might blow key bridges or dams before his troops arrived. To prevent this, he ordered Brigadier General Otto Weyland, commander of the 19th Tactical Air Command, to deploy fighter bombers to guard vital infrastructure. Until American forces could reach them, the skies would be the bridge guards. Patton believed in instinct. He once claimed to possess a sixth sense, an almost mystical ability to divine the enemy's intentions before they materialized. As his forces swept into Brittany, he estimated there were no more than 10,000 German troops scattered across the peninsula. The real number, however, was 6 times that. Over 60,000 Axis soldiers, some Wehrmacht, some Luftwaffe, many second-line garrison troops, were dug in across Brittany's ports, hills, and coastal towns. Patton had misjudged the scale of resistance, and it wouldn't be long before that miscalculation reshaped the campaign. Still, his orders were clear. General Robert Grow and his 6th Armoured Division were to drive west, bypass resistance, and seize the fortress port of Brest without delay. Patton gave no consideration to smaller objectives or fortified towns along the way. That same day, however, orders arrived from above. Take Brittany, yes, but with as few troops as possible. Patton responded by shifting his 15th and 20th Corps away from the peninsula, redirecting them east toward Le Mans. Only Middleton's 8th Corps would remain behind to secure the entire Breton Peninsula. It was a bold gamble, one that would stretch supply lines and test morale. In his drive for speed, Patton even overruled Middleton himself. While the 8th Corps commander had instructed his divisions to first capture Saint-Malo on the Channel coast, then pivot south toward Dinant before turning west for the 125-mile push to Brest, Patton dismissed the plan entirely. He wanted Brest first and fast. The rest, he insisted, could wait. Air support was delayed. American P-47 Thunderbolts didn't arrive over the battlefield until late afternoon on August 1st. But once they were in the air, they began carving a path through the countryside. Using Allied intelligence sourced from ultra-intercepts, the 6th Armoured Division's 2 combat commands advanced 45 miles in just 2 days. German anti-tank guns disguised in hay wagons were rooted out and destroyed. 3 dreaded 88mm flak guns were taken out before they could wreak havoc. P-47 ranged far ahead of the columns, strafing retreating units and shielding the advancing armour. To avoid friendly fire, American tank crews marked their vehicles with brightly coloured panels fixed to the turrets, easily visible from above. Misidentification was a real risk, especially given the speed of the advance and the patchwork of broken German formations still fighting in pockets along the roads. On August 3rd, the advance guard of the 6th Armoured rolled into the town of Mortain. A platoon came under small arms and cannon fire at the edge of the town. Rather than pull back, they held their ground and returned fire, while the rest of the company flanked north. Several German machine gun nests were knocked out, and by nightfall, the defenders had abandoned the town. The push westward continued. The next day, Combat Command A reached Pontivy, only to find the town's key bridge had been destroyed. The advance could have stalled, but Sergeant Malcolm Helton of the 68th Tank Battalion's reconnaissance platoon began searching the terrain. Against orders, he pushed forward on foot and located an alternate crossing over both the river and canal. His initiative kept the momentum alive, and for his actions, Helton was awarded the Bronze Star. The column pressed on, covering over 60 miles beyond Mortain. Lieutenant Robert J. Burns Jr., writing the official battalion history, would later call it one of the most daring, brilliantly led, under-pressure armoured stabs made thus far in the march. But the closer the Americans came to the western tip of Brittany, the harder the resistance became. At Huelgoat, 75 miles east of Brest, the 6th Armoured met its fiercest opposition yet. Wehrmacht troops equipped with Panzerfausts ambushed the lead Shermans. One American tank was hit and set ablaze. Inside, the crew kept fighting, manning their machine guns even as flames began to rise. When the heat became unbearable, they bailed out, only to find themselves surrounded. German infantry demanded their surrender. The tankers refused. Firing from the hip at close range, they took down several attackers before machine gun bursts killed 2 of them instantly. Technician 4th grade Charles E. Pidcock kept firing his submachine gun until the burning tank behind him exploded, launching his body into a hedgerow. Against all odds, he survived. For their bravery, all 3 men were awarded the Silver Star. It was a stark reminder that even in the midst of a collapsing front, the German soldier could still be deadly and determined. Task Force Daval redeployed to the town of Plouvian, 10 miles north of Brest. Its reconnaissance platoon had driven German pickets from the outskirts, and the main force rolled in, expecting a quiet night. But as the Shermans parked up and the infantry began to bivouac, sudden gunfire echoed through the narrow streets. In the darkness, chaos erupted. Unbeknownst to either side, 1,500 men of the German 265th Infantry Division had marched into Plouvian at the very same time. The 2 forces collided in the town square. Captain Raymond Polk, commanding Able Company, immediately gathered a section of Sherman tanks and counterattacked. But the Germans were well armed and well prepared, blocking the American armor with a storm of small arms fire, mortars, and Panzerfausts. Polk's attack stalled. The standoff threatened to become a bloody street battle. Relying on intelligence reports, Grow ordered Polk to regroup and maneuver. A flanking attack was organized. Shermans wheeled against the German right, while infantry probed from the opposite side. Overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts dived onto enemy columns moving into position. Realizing they were being enveloped, the Germans pulled out of the town under fire. For his leadership in the action, Polk was awarded the Silver Star. Yet Brest itself remained in German hands. Patton, impatient, refused to allow Grow to bog his entire division down in a protracted siege. His orders were blunt: leave a screening force to hold the Germans inside the city, and send the rest of the 6th Armoured Division south to Lorient and beyond. Brest would wait. What mattered was a momentum. Though the fortress still stood, the German forces in Brittany's interior were shattered, no longer capable of mounting a coordinated counterattack against the Allied rear as the main armies pushed east toward Paris. While Grow turned south, Patton gave Middleton a new assignment. His task was to contain the powerful German garrison at Saint-Malo, a port city bristling with fortifications. At first, Middleton had only a single task force of cavalry scouts and tank destroyers. Reinforcements soon arrived in the form of Major General Robert Macon's 83rd Infantry Division. The Germans at Saint-Malo were commanded by Oberst Andreas von Auloch, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had fought at Stalingrad. Now, with some 12,000 men of the 79th Infantry Division and fortress troops, he pledged to hold Saint-Malo to the last stone. Facing him were 20,000 Americans with armor, artillery, and air power at their disposal. The battle began on August 4th and dragged on for 2 weeks. Inside the city, the fighting was savage. Street by street, house by house, American infantry cleared machine gun nests and strongpoints. From the air, US fighters and bombers sank 2 German warships and reduced harbor bunkers to rubble. The Germans, knowing the port would inevitably fall, set fire to the city, demolished its infrastructure, and withdrew to hardened defensive positions outside the walls. There, the true battle began. The Germans had prepared deep bunkers and camouflaged pillboxes from which they fought with grim determination. The Americans brought up heavy artillery, pounding every suspected strong point until one by one the defenses collapsed. By August 17th, the garrison could fight no longer. Von Auloch's men marched out in surrender. One American infantryman, Private Frank Reichmann of the 331st Regiment, remembered the moment vividly. A platoon of captured Germans started singing farewell to their commander, he recalled. Most of them were in tears. Even in defeat, the German soldiers of Saint-Malo had fought with the same fatal resolve that had carried them across a dozen battlefields. It would take 3 full American divisions, 75,000 men, to finally force the surrender of Brest on August 25th, As in Saint-Malo, the Germans fought bitterly to the end, and when they could hold no longer, they destroyed what they had sworn to defend. Demolition teams gutted the deep-water port, tearing apart the docks, scuttling ships, and reducing the city to ruins. Their work was devastatingly effective. Eisenhower had once envisioned the ports of Brittany as vital supply hubs for the Allied advance. But in the end, they were too far from the front. Brest was never used by Allied cargo or troop ships. Quiberon was never built. Strategically, the bloodshed in Brittany had gained little, beyond tying down German divisions that might otherwise have fought elsewhere. While Gross's 6th Armoured Division was racing toward Brest, Major General John Wood's 4th Armoured Division was driving hard toward Rennes. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans intended to burn their supply depots there, and Patton pushed Wood to seize the city before the destruction could take place. In the chaos, Patton nearly created his own disaster. Mistaking one of Wood's armoured columns for a German force, he ordered General Weyland's strike aircraft to destroy it. Only the sharp eyes of the lead pilots, who spotted the panels on the Shermans below, averted catastrophe. Instead of hitting Americans, they raced ahead of the column and destroyed several German 88mm batteries. On August 2nd, Wood's men reached Rennes, only to find it heavily defended. Patton ordered the city bypassed and pushed the advance south toward Lorient. The Germans torched their dumps the next day and pulled out. A counterattack by 15 German tanks on August 4th was beaten back, largely by American fighter bombers swooping in from above. Wood's advance never slowed. On August 5th, his division captured Vannes on the Bay of Biscay, cutting the last viable escape route for German forces still trapped in Brittany. That same day, Wood drove on Lorient. The U-boat base there, manned by a large garrison and ringed by bunkers, stopped him cold. A similar story played out further south at Saint-Nazaire, another fortress anchoring the coast. Instead of battering uselessly against the defences, Wood turned his attention east. He requested permission from Middleton to seize Nantes, the city on the river Loire. Permission granted, Colonel Bruce Clark's combat commander raced 80 miles in a single dash. With the help of French resistance fighters, who guided his columns through German lines, Clark stormed the city. Within hours, Nantes, one of France's largest cities and a key port at the mouth of the Loire, was in American hands. By late August, Middleton's 8th Corps had accomplished nearly all of its objectives. The Germans still held out in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, but they were isolated fortresses now, bottled up until the war's end. With the situation in Brittany stabilized, the 4th and 6th Armoured Divisions were freed to rejoin the main army and push east toward Germany. The campaign in Brittany was effectively over. While Middleton's corps swept Brittany clear, the rest of Patton's Third Army was already shifting east. The target was Le Mans, 110 miles from Avranches. The advance began with the veterans of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. Under Major General Clarence Hubner, they captured the town of Mortain, 20 miles east of Avranches, before pushing onward. Behind them came Hobbs' 30th Infantry Division, which secured Mortain itself. East of Mortain rose a rugged height called Montjoie. To the GIs it was simply Hill 314, named for its elevation in meters. From its crest one could see for miles across the Normandy countryside. For the Americans it was the perfect observation post. Soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, climbed the hill alongside Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss, an artillery forward observer from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. His radios would soon prove more valuable than any rifle. At the same time, Adolf Hitler was planning a counterstrike that he believed could turn the tide of the campaign. Furious at the Allied breakout from Avranches, he ordered 4 Panzer Divisions into a desperate thrust designed to cut the American advance in half. If the attack succeeded, Patton's Third Army would be severed from Courtney Hodges' First Army. The Allies would be split in two. Operation Lüttich, as the Germans called it, was to be a blow worthy of 1940. In the early hours of August 7th, the attack began. 26,000 German infantry, supported by nearly 300 tanks and assault guns, pushed forward through the fog and darkness toward Mortain. To avoid Allied aircraft, the panzers rolled at night. But from the very start, things went wrong. Orders were confused, traffic snarled, and of the 6 attacking columns, only 3 moved on time. The 116th Panzer Division, assigned the crucial right flank, failed to advance at all. Even so, when the hammer fell, it fell hard. The heaviest blow struck the American 30th Infantry Division, defending the crossroads at Saint-Barthélemy, just 2 miles north of Mortain. There, the battlefield became a furnace. American Shermans and German Panthers fired at one another across hedgerows, their shots smashing through stone walls and barns. GI bazooka teams waited in foxholes, firing into the flanks of Panzer grenadiers as they advanced behind the armour. "It was a storm of steel," one US veteran recalled. "You couldn't raise your head without bullets cutting the air." For 6 hours, the Americans clung on. Nearly 40 German panzers were destroyed in the fighting. At Abbé Blanche, a tiny platoon of 66 men armed with bazookas and rifles stood their ground against an entire SS regiment. Against all expectation, they forced the Waffen-SS back, inflicting shocking casualties. Elsewhere, American artillery and tank destroyers claimed another 60 tanks, leaving smoking hulks littering the fields. When the morning fog finally lifted, Allied P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down like hawks. Bombs and rockets fell among the panzer columns. For the Germans below, it was slaughter, yet these were not green troops. They were the battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had fought against the Red Army in far worse conditions. They did not break. The 2nd Panzer Division pushed 4 miles through the northern sector, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, drove directly into Mortain itself, cutting off American defenders and threatening to roll on toward Avranches. On Hill 314, the battle had become apocalyptic. Lieutenant Weiss, crouched over his radios, began calling fire missions at dawn. His view was obscured by fog, smoke, and trees. He adjusted his barrages by sound, map coordinates, and desperate guesswork. "Fire! Keep firing!" he shouted into the handset. Explosions rippled down the slopes of the hill, tearing into German ranks that clawed their way upward. The SS and Panzer Grenadiers came in waves, pressing up the eastern and southern approaches simultaneously. Mortars crashed among the defenders. The dreaded 88mm guns hammered the hilltop with direct fire, shattering rocks and men alike. The defenders clung on. Surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted, they fought from foxholes, calling artillery so close that shells burst inside their own perimeter. Weiss later admitted that he adjusted fire onto his own command post to break up an SS assault only yards away. The hill shook with each impact, the Americans pressing their faces into the dirt as the world turned white with dust and shrapnel. Described the carnage. "We had nothing left. No food, no water, no sleep. Only ammunition, and even that we took from the bodies." Corpses were dragged into rocky clefts to form makeshift morgues, while the living scavenged the dead for bullets and grenades. German voices echoed up the slopes, sometimes shouting in English, trying to trick the defenders into exposing themselves. The fighting was close, personal, and without mercy. Still, the hill held. Hill 314 became the anvil on which the German counterattack broke. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry, less than 700 men, had been encircled by thousands of German troops, including elements of the Waffen-SS. For 5 days they resisted, 5 days without proper supplies, without water, under constant shell fire and attack. 5 days in which their stubborn stand prevented the Germans from cutting off the Avranches corridor and ultimately doomed Hitler's counteroffensive to failure. When the Germans finally withdrew, the ground was soaked in blood. Of the 670 Americans who had climbed Hill 314, nearly 300 were dead or wounded. The Waffen-SS had also bled heavily, their ranks shredded by artillery and air power. Both sides had fought with ferocity that stunned even veterans of the Eastern Front. For the Americans, it was survival. For the Germans, it was duty. For all, it was hell. The German advance ground to a halt beneath a storm of American artillery. From the crest of Hill 314, Lieutenant Robert Weiss and his forward observers called down fire with cold precision. For hour after hour, shells arced in from batteries miles away, smashing into columns of panzers and waves of panzer grenadiers trying to move through the fields and lanes below. White phosphorus shells burst among the hedgerows, forcing German infantry into the open. High explosive rounds followed, tearing them apart in clouds of smoke and dirt. One survivor remembered the sight. The whole valley was lit up with flame. Their men ran screaming out of the hedges, and then another barrage would land. We didn't think anyone could live through it. By nightfall on August 7th, the German attack had stalled. Despite outnumbering the Americans several times over, the Waffen-SS and Panzer Divisions could not smash through the 6,000 defenders of the US 30th Infantry Division. Hill 314 had become the keystone of the American defense, and every German assault seemed to break against it. The next day, August 8th, the punishment only grew worse. Allied artillery raked German positions without pause, and when the fog lifted, P-47 Thunderbolts descended on the fields around Mortain, bombing and strafing columns caught in the open. "We must risk everything," Field Marshal Günther von Kluge told his staff grimly, knowing already that the battle was lost. But Hitler would not allow retreat. Orders came down from Berlin. The attack must be renewed no matter the cost. Von Kluge scraped together a new Kampfgruppe under General Heinrich Eberbach of the 5th Panzer Army. The Americans atop Hill 314 soon learned what that meant. In the afternoon, a Waffen-SS officer appeared under a flag of truce, climbing up the rocky slopes to deliver an ultimatum: surrender the hill or be annihilated. Lieutenant Ralph Curley listened to the demand in silence, then spat out a string of profanity and sent the officer back down the slope. Minutes later, the hill was engulfed in fire. Mortars, 88mm guns, and artillery rained down in a storm meant to crush the defenders once and for all. Conditions for the Americans were nightmarish. Food and water had run out. Ammunition was scavenged from the dead. The fallen were dragged into a makeshift morgue among the rocks, hidden from sight but not from smell. "We stacked the bodies in a gully and covered them with blankets," one GI recalled. "But the stench carried on the wind. It stayed with you, in your clothes, in your mouth. We fought surrounded by our dead. Every attempt to resupply the hill failed. Artillery shells packed with rations burst on impact, scattering food across the rocks. C-47 aircraft dropped bundles by parachute, but the wind carried them into German lines. The men on the hill were utterly alone, fighting with what little they had left. And yet, Hill 314 refused to fall. Day after day, the SS launched assaults up the slopes. Day after day, Weiss called down artillery so close that American foxholes shook with their own explosions. "I knew it was coming in on us," one officer said, "but it was the only way to stop them." By August 12th, after 5 days of savage fighting, the Germans finally gave up the effort. The counteroffensive toward Avranches had failed. On the hill, silence fell for the first time in nearly a week. A relief regiment from the US 35th Division climbed the battered slopes and found the survivors, hollow-eyed, filthy and gaunt. 300 men had to be carried down as casualties. Another 370, wounded but still able to walk, staggered down on their own. Nearly half the defenders of Hill 314 were gone. The 30th Division alone had suffered 1,800 casualties in the Mortain sector, with other units losing almost as many. The Waffen-SS had bled heavily too. Their armour was wrecked, their infantry mauled, their offensive power broken. Hitler's gamble had cost him thousands of irreplaceable men and machines and gained him nothing. For the Americans, the stand on Hill 314 became a symbol of endurance against impossible odds. For the Germans, it was proof that even their elite Panzer and SS divisions could no longer force a decision in the West. The Mortain counterattack had failed. In its aftermath, Bradley ordered Patton east toward Le Mans. The breakout from Normandy was complete, and now Patton's Third Army was unleashed in full. Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley saw clearly what Hill 314 had made possible: the race to the Seine, the encirclement of the German 7th Army, and the collapse of German power in France. The defenders of Hill 314 had held the line, and in doing so, they had broken Hitler's last hope in Normandy. Stories of Hill 314 and what later became known as the Lost Battalion have never really faded. The men who held that ridge between August 6th and 12th, 1944, left behind more than just a battle. They left something that stuck. 40 years later, in 1984, many of them returned to Mortain for the anniversary. Inside the mayor's office, there's still a giant poster from that day, signed by dozens of veterans, including Robert Weiss, the artillery observer, who called in fire missions for 6 days straight. His name, written in black marker, now sits framed among the memories. Weiss would come back more than once. So did Frank Denius. Both wrote about what they went through. Weiss in Fire Mission and Denius in his 2016 memoir. In 2011, their stories helped inspire a small documentary called Heroes of Old Hickory. It was filmed partly in Mortain, with the surviving veterans driven through the town in open-top jeeps, waving to locals who still remembered. The last time they had driven through those streets, they were covered in dirt, blood, and exhaustion. Now they were greeted with cheers and flags, just like in 1944. In July 2020, something long overdue finally happened. The 30th Infantry Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, recognition for what they did at Mortain and Hill 314. A celebration was held in Raleigh, North Carolina. Tony Jaber, who'd served as a mortar gunner under Lieutenant Curley on the hill, showed up. Looking back, he said, "I wondered if we'd ever get rescued, but I didn't think I'd get killed up there. We had a company commander who wouldn't surrender, so we were lucky. If you go to Mortain today, there are signs pointing the way to Cote 314. The western side is open to the public. You can walk a marked trail through the rocks of Montjoie. Along the way, there are plaques showing where key parts of the action took place." A local French landowner made sure the memory stayed alive, but if you cross to the east side, down toward the old Bel Air Road, things change. That part of the hill is private land now, dense forest, totally overgrown. It's been turned into a hunting reserve. And it feels forgotten, like time stopped moving there. When Weiss returned to Mortain in 1994, he tried to find his old positions. He couldn't. The ridge he once held with artillery fire was gone, swallowed by trees. Still, in one small clearing, just a dip in the ground really, he stopped. He believed it was the place where he'd last seen Sergeant John Corn. And there, quietly, Weiss saluted. Then he turned around and left the hill one final time. Some battles live on in documentaries or museum exhibits. Others just fade into the landscape, whispered through trees, carried in letters, remembered by a few. Hill 314 is one of those. It's not famous, it's not a symbol, but for the men who were there, it was everything, and they held it. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Hill 314 isn't the kind of battle they teach in school, but it mattered, and the men who fought there deserve to be remembered. If you want more stories like this, the ones history books skip over, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you had family who served in Normandy or knew someone in the 30th Infantry Division, share their story. I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye for now.